Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that wander through the strange and forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that toe the line between the eerie and the absurd. Tonight, we drift into the Renaissance, where laughter was not always the best medicine. Sometimes it was the last thing you'd ever do. Chapter 1. The Curious Case of the Laughing Death. The year was 1556, and the city of Florence was a place where beauty and brutality walked hand in hand. The streets were alive with the scent of fresh paint from the workshops of artists who would one day be called masters, and the air hummed with the murmurs of philosophers debating the nature of man. But beneath the grandeur, there was something else. A whisper, a rumor, a story too strange to be true, yet too persistent to ignore. People were dying from laughter. It began with a baker named Luca, a man whose jowls shook like rising dough when he chuckled. He was known for his merry disposition, the kind of man who could turn even a funeral procession into a raucous affair with a well-timed joke. One evening, at a feast celebrating the wedding of a local nobleman's daughter, Luca found himself caught in a fit of mirth so violent that his ribs ached. The guests roared along with him, tears streaming down their faces, until suddenly Luca wasn't laughing anymore. He was gasping. His face, once red with joy, turned purple. His hands clawed at his throat as if the laughter itself had become a noose. By the time the physician arrived, Luca was dead, his lips still curled in a ghastly smile. The physician, a wiry man named Dottore Moretti, had seen many things in his years: plagues, fevers, wounds that oozed with the promise of death. But this was something new. He examined Luca's body with the precision of a man who believed every corpse had a story to tell. The lungs were swollen, the heart engorged with blood. There were no signs of poison, no hidden stab wounds. The man had, quite simply, laughed himself to death. At first, the incident was dismissed as a freak occurrence, a tragic oddity. But then it happened again, and again. A wealthy merchant's wife collapsed during a puppet show, her final breaths escaping as giggles. A young scholar, notorious for his wit, perished mid-debate after a particularly cutting remark sent him into hysterics. The deaths were swift, inexplicable, and worst of all, contagious, because nothing spreads faster than laughter. The people of Florence began to wonder if this was divine punishment, a jest from God himself. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of excess, of losing oneself to the frivolity of the flesh. Physicians scrambled to explain the phenomenon, some blaming an imbalance of humors, others suspecting invisible miasmas that preyed upon the joyous. But the more they tried to rationalize it, the more the laughing deaths defied explanation. In the shadows, though, there were those who saw opportunity. Charlatans sold amulets guaranteed to ward off the giggling curse. Apothecaries brewed tonics so bitter they would make even the most light-hearted soul grimace. And then there were the professional mourners who found themselves out of work in a city where laughter was the new specter of death. They adapted, of course, offering their services as solemnity enforcers, hired to keep gatherings appropriately somber. One such enforcer was a woman named Beatrice, a widow with a voice like gravel and a glare that could freeze wine in its cup. She had spent years perfecting the art of sorrow, and now, in this strange new world, her skills were in high demand. She attended feasts not to eat, but to glower. She patrolled taverns, shushing anyone whose laughter threatened to crest beyond a polite chuckle. For a fee, she would even stand behind a particularly jovial guest and whisper dire predictions into their ear until their smile withered. Business was booming, but even Beatrice couldn't stifle the human spirit forever. Because the truth was, in a time of plague and poverty, of rigid hierarchies and arbitrary justice, laughter was one of the few freedoms left. And so, despite the risks, people kept laughing. Quietly, nervously, but they laughed. because to surrender that was to surrender something essential, something even death couldn't steal without a fight. And so the Renaissance rolled on, a time of great art and greater absurdity, where a man could be immortalized in paint one day and killed by his own joy the next. The laughing deaths never truly disappeared. They simply faded into the background, another strange footnote in history's ledger, waiting to be unearthed by those who dare to ask, what happens when mirth becomes mortal? Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Fatal Chuckle. Dottore Moretti had always believed that laughter was, in moderation, a sign of good health. The ancients had written of its virtues. Galen himself praised its ability to balance the humors, and Hippocrates had once prescribed a day of merriment to a melancholic patient. But now, as he stood over yet another victim of this inexplicable malady, the old physician found himself questioning everything he knew. The body before him belonged to a young lute player named Carlo, who had collapsed in the middle of a bawdy tavern song, his final notes dissolving into breathless, uncontrollable giggles before silence took him. Moretti was not a man prone to superstition, but even he had to consider whether there was something unnatural at work. The church whispered of demons who delighted in human folly, tickling their victims to death with invisible fingers. The common folk muttered about curses, or perhaps the revenge of some long-forgotten court jester executed for a joke that cut too close to the bone. But Moretti was a scholar, and scholars sought answers in the body, not in stories. With a sigh, he picked up his scalpel and began his work. The first incision revealed what he had come to expect. Carlo's lungs were heavy, saturated with blood, as if they had been drowned from within. His heart was engorged, its chambers stretched to their limits. Moretti frowned. It was as though the man's own joy had flooded his veins, filling him until he burst. The mechanics of it, once he pieced them together, were almost elegant in their cruelty. Laughter, in its essence, was a violent thing. A true body-shaking laugh forced air out in sharp bursts, collapsing the lungs again and again like a bellows worked too hard. The diaphragm spasmed, the ribs strained, and the heart, already laboring to keep pace with the body's frantic gasps, could simply give out. A weak valve might rupture under the pressure. An old scar in the heart's tissue might tear open like a poorly stitched seam. And then, in an instant, the laughter that had been a celebration of life became its end. Moretti had seen it before in men who ran too hard or fought too long, their bodies failing under exertion. But this was different. This was a death that came not from exertion of the body, but from an excess of feeling. It was as if the soul itself had grown too large for its vessel. He was not the only one trying to make sense of it. Across Florence, physicians and alchemists traded theories like playing cards. Some argued that certain laughters were more dangerous than others. Deep, guttural chuckles were said to be safer than the high, shrieking variety that seemed to scrape the inside of the throat. Others believed it was the suddenness of the mirth that killed, a shock to the system as deadly as a plunge into icy water. One particularly eccentric scholar, a man who had once tried to distill the essence of happiness into a drinkable elixir, claimed that the fatal laughter at all but a kind of seizure disguised as joy. Theories aside, the practical question remained. How did one prevent it? The wealthy began to employ laughter tutors, men and women trained in the art of measured amusement. They taught their patrons to cluck politely rather than guffaw, to smile without engaging the lungs. Some even prescribed daily exercises in controlled breathing, lest an unexpected joke send one into a lethal spiral of glee. For the poor, who could not afford such luxuries, superstition filled the gaps. Mothers tucked sprigs of rue into their children's collars, an herb said to ward off excessive mirth. Tavern keepers watered down their wine, believing strong drink made laughter too reckless. And in the darkest corners of the city, there were those who simply stopped laughing altogether, their faces settling into masks of wary neutrality, as if joy itself had become a loaded weapon. But humans, as a rule, are terrible at resisting temptation. And so, despite the risks, laughter persisted. It became a dare, a gamble, a thing to be enjoyed in stolen moments. There was a thrill in it now, the knowledge that each chuckle might be the last. Moretti, for his part, never found a cure. He could only document, measure, and wonder. In his final notes on the subject, written in a hand grown shaky with age, he mused that perhaps the real mystery was not why some died of laughter, but why so many others did not. After all, every laugh was, in its way, a little leap into the unknown. Most survived it. Some did not. And that, he supposed, was the joke. Meanwhile, in the streets life went on. The artists kept painting, the philosophers kept debating, and the people kept laughing. Softly, carefully, but laughing all the same. Because even in the shadow of death, there were some things too precious to surrender. Chapter 3. The Court Jester's Dilemma. The Duke's court was unusually quiet that evening. The usual murmur of nobles exchanging gossip had been replaced by tense silence, broken only by the occasional nervous call. At the center of the hall, perched on a low stool with his bells oddly still, sat Jacopo the fool. Though in that moment he looked anything but foolish. His motley sleeves, normally fluttering with exaggerated gestures, hung limp at his sides. His painted smile seemed frozen in place, less an expression of mirth than a grimace of survival. Jacopo had been the Duke's jester for 14 years, a tenure that had outlasted 3 wives, 5 favorite hunting dogs, and at least 2 court physicians. Longevity, in his profession, was a rare achievement. Most jesters either wore out their welcome with one ill-timed joke too many, or were quietly disposed of when their lord's humor soured. But Jacopo had survived by mastering a delicate calculus: how to amuse without provoking, to tease without wounding, to walk the razor's edge between hilarity and treason. Now, though, the rules had changed. The laughing deaths had reached the nobility. Just last week, the young Count of Montefiore had expired at a banquet after Jacopo's particularly clever jab at his notorious stinginess. The Count had roared with laughter, pounding the table so hard the wine goblets danced. And then, mid-chuckle, his face had darkened, his hands had flown to his chest, and he had slid gracelessly beneath the table, dead before he hit the floor. The Duke, after a moment of stunned silence, had declared it the finest punchline of the evening. But Jacopo had seen the calculating look in his patron's eyes. The Duke was no fool. He understood the new power his jester wielded, the power to kill with a joke. It should have been a position of strength. Instead, Jacopo found himself trapped. Too cautious, and he'd be dismissed for dullness. Too bold, and he might send another noble into fatal convulsions. Worse still, the court had developed a macabre fascination with the risk. Noblemen egged him on, daring one another to withstand his wit without succumbing. Ladies placed bets on who might be next. The Duke himself had taken to watching Jacopo with the amused detachment of a gambler rolling dice, waiting to see where they landed. That night's performance had been a disaster. Every jest felt like a loaded die. His usual repertoire, mock battles with the inflatable bladder, impressions of the Duke's stuffy advisors, fell flat. The court's laughter was forced, tinged with fear. Even the children, normally his most forgiving audience, sat stiffly in their finery, as if their parents had warned them that laughter might be fatal. Afterward, in the cramped closet that served as his chambers, Jacopo poured himself a generous cup of wine, watered as all wine was now, and considered his options. He could flee, of course, disappear into the countryside, take up honest work as a farmer or a beggar. But a jester without a court was just a man in ridiculous clothes, and the Duke did not take kindly to desertion. He could also lean into his newfound lethality, become a jester assassin, coaxing enemies of the state into fatal giggles. But that path led to paranoid lords and early graves. Or he could do what he had always done, adapt. The next evening, Jacopo returned to the hall with a new act. Gone were the slapstick antics and bawdy songs. Instead, he had crafted something subtler, a performance that walked the line between comedy and meditation. He told stories, long, winding tales with gentle humor woven throughout, the kind that coaxed smiles rather than guffaws. He employed irony, wit so dry it barely rippled the air. He became a master of the delayed laugh, the kind that crept up on a listener minutes later, too late to do any harm. To his surprise, it worked. The court, starved for amusement but terrified of excess, embraced this new style. The Duke, intrigued by the novelty, declared it a stroke of genius. Jacopo's reputation grew, not as a bringer of death, but as a purveyor of refined, survivable humor. Other jesters began emulating his techniques. Manuals were written on the art of measured comedy. But Jacopo never forgot the precariousness of his position. Every laugh was still a gamble, every joke a potential death sentence. Some nights, lying awake in his closet, he wondered if this was the true punishment of his profession. Not the risk of execution or disgrace, but the burden of knowing that his gift, his art, could be deadly. And yet, he kept performing, because in the end, that was the jester's dilemma. The only thing more dangerous than making them laugh was failing to. Chapter 4. A Nobleman's Last Giggle. The banquet hall of Palazzo Ridolfi shimmered with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of roasted boar and spiced wine. It was the sort of occasion designed to showcase wealth and power. Gold plates piled high with delicacies, musicians playing discreetly in the alcoves, servants weaving through the crowd with practiced invisibility. At the head table, resplendent in crimson velvet, sat Count Ludovico Ridolfi, a man whose girth and laugh were equally legendary. Ludovico had built his reputation on excess. His cellars were the deepest in Florence, his feasts the most extravagant, his humor the most unrefined. Where other nobles cultivated wit, Ludovico preferred his comedy broad and bawdy, pratfalls, flatulence jokes, the occasional pie to the face. His laughter was a force of nature, a booming cannonade that shook chandeliers and startled birds from the garden. That night, as the fourth course was cleared, he was in rare form. The entertainment had been arranged by his steward, a nervous man who had taken recent events to heart. Instead of the usual troupe of acrobats and jesters, he had hired a philosopher, a gaunt Sicilian named Brother Bernardo, whose discourses on ethics were said to be so dry they could preserve meat. The steward reckoned a lecture on Aristotelian virtue would be safe. He was wrong. Brother Bernardo had barely begun his treatise when Ludovico interrupted with a loud belch, followed by an even louder jest about philosophers and their lack of practical skills. The nobleman's cronies roared. The philosopher, unperturbed, adjusted his spectacles and countered with a metaphor about empty vessels making the most noise. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Ludovico, instead of taking offense, let out a bark of laughter so sharp it startled a servant into dropping a platter of figs. The sound seemed to feed on itself, growing louder, deeper, more uncontrollable. He laughed until tears streamed down his florid cheeks, until his breath came in wheezing gulps, until his vast belly shook like a ship in a storm. The guests, first amused, then concerned, watched as his face darkened from pink to purple. His hands clutched at the tablecloth, sending goblets crashing to the floor. "Enough, my lord," murmured his physician, rising from his seat. But it was too late. Ludovico's final laugh emerged as a strangled hiccup. His eyes bulged. A terrible stillness overtook him, broken only when his massive frame toppled forward into a gelatin mold shaped like the family crest. The silence that followed was absolute. Then chaos erupted. Physicians rushed forward, leeches at the ready. The countess fainted gracefully into the arms of a footman. Brother Bernardo, surveying the scene with academic detachment, remarked that this was perhaps the most literal demonstration of hubris he had ever witnessed, which did little to endear him to the grieving widow. By dawn, the story had spread across Florence. The Ridolfi family, mortified, insisted their patriarch had been poisoned. The servants, bribed into silence, whispered otherwise. Dottore Moretti, summoned to examine the body, found the same telltale signs: the engorged heart, the lungs filled with blood that had marked so many laughing deaths. But this case was different. This was nobility. The incident sent ripples through high society. Suddenly, restraint became fashionable. Heavy foods were blamed for sluggish humors, and banquets grew more subdued. Wealthy patrons commissioned somber artworks to hang in their dining halls as reminders of mortality. Some families went further, hiring professional mourners to attend feasts as a deterrent against excessive merriment. For the common folk, however, Ludovico's death became a source of dark humor. Ballads sprung up, celebrating the nobleman who loved a joke so much he died for one. Street performers reenacted the scene with exaggerated gusto, though they wisely omitted the final collapse. Even Jacopo the Fool incorporated a veiled reference into his act. A bit about a man so afraid of boredom he chose laughter over life, which earned him a sharp look from the Duke, but no punishment. As for Brother Bernardo, he found himself unexpectedly in demand. His dry, humorless lectures became a safeguard against accidental hilarity, a sort of intellectual inoculation. Noble houses competed to host him, not for his wisdom, but for his proven ability to suppress dangerous laughter. The philosopher, unaware or indifferent to this irony, accepted their patronage with solemn gratitude. And so life in Florence adjusted once more, finding equilibrium between joy and caution. But in the taverns, in the kitchens, in the places where servants gathered after their masters slept, the story of Count Ludovico was told and retold, always with a smile, often with a suppressed chuckle, because some truths were too ridiculous not to laugh at, even if laughter could kill you. The Ridolfi banquet became a cautionary tale, a punchline, and finally, a legend. And legends, as everyone knows, never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to make you laugh again. Chapter 5. The Plague of Mirth. The summer of 1564 should have been remembered for the ripening of grapes in the Tuscan hills, for the way the Arno glittered under the bridge at noon, for the usual petty squabbles between guilds that kept Florence's magistrates occupied. Instead, it became known as the season when death wore two faces, one grim and familiar, the other grinning like a skull in motley. But the plague had returned. It began quietly, as plague always does. A fisherman's wife coughing blood into her stew. A priest collapsing mid-sermon. Then the death carts appeared, their drivers masked against miasma, their bells tolling endlessly through deserted streets. Shops closed. The rich fled to country villas. The poor barricaded themselves in cramped rooms, praying their neighbors wouldn't cough. And yet, against all reason, the laughter persisted. At first it manifested as nervous giggles in the quarantine lines. Then, as hysterical cackles from shuttered windows. By the time the corpses piled too high for timely burial, full-blown fits of mirth had become epidemic. Some said it was the terror that did it, the mind's final rebellion against unrelenting dread. Others whispered of demonic influence, of imps tickling the doomed in their final hours. Dottore Moretti, moving wearily between plague cases and laughing deaths, noted a curious pattern. Those who succumbed to mirth often survived longer than their melancholic counterparts, as if joy, even fatal joy, somehow delayed the inevitable. The church took a predictably dim view. Friars preached against the devil's levity, urging penance instead of merriment. Confessionals overflowed with parishioners repenting not just sins, but smiles. One particularly zealous bishop ordered the public burning of joke books and theatrical props, which resulted in an unintended spectacle when a troupe of actors, already suffering from suppressed laughter, collapsed in hysterics at the sight of their inflatable bladders popping in the flames. 3 died on the spot. For the medical community, this presented both crisis and opportunity. Barber surgeons advertised anti-mirth bleedings. Apothecaries sold tinctures of belladonna mixed with lead, guaranteed to sober the humors. A traveling charlatan named Dr. Grimaldi peddled an elaborate harness said to restrain the diaphragm from excessive movement. It mostly served to make wearers look like trussed chickens, which ironically provoked the very laughter it was meant to prevent. Jacopo the Fool found himself in peculiar demand. Plague-stricken households hired him not to entertain, but to test their sick. If the patient could withstand his jests without fatal paroxysms, recovery was deemed likely. He developed a graduated system: gentle puns for convalescents, mild innuendo for stronger cases, reserving his most devastating material as a sort of comedic triage. Those who survived his sharpest barbs usually survived the plague. The phenomenon reached its zenith during the festival of San Giovanni, normally a day of joyous celebration. With the city half empty and the traditional parade cancelled, a group of desperate revelers staged an impromptu masquerade in the abandoned marketplace. They danced with death's head masks, drank vinegar wine, and told increasingly outrageous jokes, each more dangerous than the last. By midnight, 7 lay dead on the cobblestones, their frozen smiles visible beneath lifted plague masks. The survivors, too giddy with survival to mourn properly, declared them martyrs to merriment and erected a makeshift shrine featuring a jester's cap nailed to a broomstick. As autumn cooled the feverish air, both plagues, the mortal and the mirthful, began to recede. The death carts grew less frequent. The surviving physicians published contradictory treatises. Jacopo returned to court, his plague-honed material now too dark for aristocratic tastes, forcing him to relearn the art of subtlety. But something had changed. The survivors of that terrible summer found they could no longer tolerate the solemnity of previous years. A new fashion emerged for morbid humor, for jokes that walked the knife edge between laughter and despair. Comedians became Florence's unlikeliest physicians, dosing the populace with carefully measured levity. Even the church softened its stance, conceding that perhaps laughter wasn't the devil's work, but God's mercy, a fleeting taste of paradise before the long silence. And so life stuttered onward. The vines bore fruit. The Arno kept flowing. In the pest houses, where the last victims coughed their final hours, you could sometimes hear a weak chuckle rising between the prayers, because when faced with the absurdity of existence, some souls simply couldn't help but laugh. Chapter 6. The Philosopher's Paradox. The University of Padua's lecture hall smelled of wax, ink, and the faint mustiness of scholars who considered bathing an unnecessary distraction from intellectual pursuits. On this gray afternoon in November, the air hummed with an unusual tension. At the podium stood Professor Marcantonio della Torre, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, about to present what he privately called the most dangerous thesis of our age. Before him sat an audience of physicians, theologians, and, most troublingly, several representatives from the Venetian Inquisition. Della Torre cleared his throat and unrolled his parchment with deliberate slowness. "Gentlemen," he began, "we gather today to contemplate the greatest paradox of human nature. That laughter which distinguishes us from beasts may also hasten us toward becoming corpses." A murmur passed through the crowd. One of the inquisitors leaned forward, his quill poised above a notebook already ominously labeled heresies. The professor proceeded to outline what he termed the double-edged theory of risibility, drawing from Aristotle's observation that man alone laughs. Della Torre argued that this divine gift contained its own built-in punishment. "Consider," he said, wiping his brow with a sleeve already stained with ink, "that God in his wisdom made joy self-regulating. No more intensely we experience mirth, the closer we approach our mortal limits. Is this not the perfect balance? A check against decadence? A young physician in the front row raised a trembling hand. Then why do some die from it while others do not? De la Torre smiled in a way that suggested he'd been waiting years for this question. Because the soul, like wine, exists in different qualities. A coarse spirit bursts its vessel easily. A refined one, here he paused to sip from a goblet, merely trembles at the edges. The metaphor, though elegant, did not satisfy everyone. Brother Tommaso, a Dominican with a face like a dried apple, stood so abruptly his stool clattered backward. This is pagan nonsense. If laughter kills, it's God's punishment for frivolity. Then why? De la Torre countered smoothly. Did St. Thomas more reportedly jest upon the scaffold? Why do the scriptures say, a merry heart doeth good like medicine, while we see it do the opposite? He had them now. The room erupted into competing arguments, Latin quotations flying like poorly aimed daggers. Outside academic circles, the debate took stranger turns. In Florence, a group of Neoplatonists began holding symposia of controlled levity, where members would tell increasingly outrageous jokes while physicians monitored their pulses. The goal was to find the precise moment when beneficial amusement became dangerous hysteria. Their findings were inconclusive, though several valuable lessons were learned about the inadvisability of combining philosophy with large quantities of spiced wine. Meanwhile, Jacopo the fool found himself unexpectedly consulted as an expert witness. "You want to know the difference between a good laugh and a deadly one?" he asked a gathering of Perugian scholars. "About 3 heartbeats and 1 poor life choice." His subsequent demonstration, involving an egg, a donkey, and a surprisingly flexible interpretation of Petrarch's sonnets, left one professor wheezing dangerously but ultimately alive, which the assembly took as proof of divine favor. The Church's position remained characteristically contradictory. While individual clerics condemned excessive mirth, the Vatican's own library contained newly commissioned treatises on therapeutic humor. Pope Pius IV, perhaps sensing which way the wind blew, issued an edict declaring that laughter in moderation demonstrates God's mercy, while immoderate laughter demonstrates his sense of justice. This satisfied no one but the lawyers, which was presumably the point. As winter tightened its grip, de la Torre's theories spread beyond Italy. French physicians wrote of la maladie de rire, German alchemists sought the laughter essence in distilled human tears, and an English playwright named Shakespeare, then just beginning his career, reportedly sketched plans for a comedy about men who literally died laughing. The concept troubled him, however, and he set it aside in favor of something involving fairies and a donkey's head. Back in Padua, de la Torre faced his greatest challenge when a visiting Ottoman scholar posed an uncomfortable question. If your God gave laughter as both gift and punishment, is he not then the first and greatest jester? The professor considered this for a long moment. Then, to the shock of his students and the horror of the inquisitors, he did something unprecedented in academic circles. He laughed. Not the dry chuckle of a scholar, but a full-bodied, knee-slapping roar that left him gasping and red-faced. When he finally regained composure, wiping tears from his eyes, he simply said, "My friend, you may have just invented a new heresy. Let's discuss it over wine." And so the paradox remained unresolved. Laughter continued to kill, even as it sustained. Physicians still debated its mechanisms while their patients died giggling. The world, in short, went on being ridiculous, which was, when one thought about it, the most philosophical joke of all. Only one conclusion seemed certain. In a universe where joy and death danced so closely, the wisest course might simply be to mind one's footing. And perhaps, when the music was particularly good, to risk a small, careful smile. Chapter 7. The Playwright's Dangerous Craft. The Globe Theatre stood unusually quiet for a Thursday afternoon. Normally actors would be running through lines, carpenters hammering last-minute set pieces, and the ever-present pickpockets testing their skills on distracted groundlings. But today, a tense silence hung over the wooden O as Will Shakespeare himself paced the sawdust-covered stage, pausing occasionally to glare at a parchment that might as well have been a death warrant. The problem was simple, and potentially lethal. A royal command performance scheduled for the following week. Queen Elizabeth herself would be in attendance, along with half her court. Normally this would be cause for celebration. The patronage of royalty could make a playwright's career. But these were not normal times. 3 months earlier, Lord Pembroke had expired during a particularly rousing performance of the Taming of the Shrew, collapsing into his wife's lap during Petruchio's "I am as peremptory as she proud-minded" speech. The coroner had listed the cause as an ague of the heart, but everyone in London's theatrical circles knew the truth. The old man had laughed himself to death. Shakespeare ran a hand through his already thinning hair. "We can't perform ye false stuff," he muttered to Richard Burbage, who was lounging on a prop throne with the casual grace of a man who hadn't yet grasped the gravity of the situation. "The Fat Knight gets more laughs than all my comedies combined. We'll have corpses piled in the aisles by Act 3. Burbage stretched lazily. "Then give them Richard III. Nothing funny about a hunchbacked villain." "Nothing funny?" Shakespeare's voice climbed an octave. "Last performance, the groundlings howled when he said, 'Now is the winter of our discontent.' They think hump jokes never get old." The problem extended far beyond the globe. Playwrights across Europe found themselves in a peculiar bind. The same noble patrons who demanded ever more elaborate comedies now came with physicians in tow, ready to intervene should the merriment grow too intense. In Madrid, Lope de Vega had taken to inserting long, dull monologues about morality whenever he noticed a particularly corpulent nobleman laughing too hard. French farce writers developed a system of subtle cues. When an actor tugged his left ear, it signaled the company to slow the pacing before the next joke. Back in London, Shakespeare had arrived at a desperate solution. "We'll write something new," he announced to his assembled players. "A tragedy so bleak, so utterly devoid of humor, that not even the most frivolous courtier will risk so much as a smirk." The result was Hamlet. Or at least, that was the intention. The first read-through went disastrously. Polonius's windy speeches provoked unexpected chuckles. The gravedigger scene, meant to underscore mortality's inevitability, had the actors in stitches. Even to be or not to be earned, uncomfortable titters from those who found existential dread oddly amusing. Shakespeare, near despair, realized he'd stumbled upon a fundamental truth about theater. Audiences will laugh at anything if properly primed. Performance night arrived with all the tension of a public execution. The Queen sat in her box, flanked by physicians holding lancets and smelling salts. The actors moved through their lines with careful precision, avoiding any hint of comic timing. And yet, when Hamlet held up Yorick's skull, something unexpected happened. Silence. Not the polite silence of bored nobility, but the breathless hush of genuine absorption. The Queen leaned forward, her famous sharp features softening in contemplation. The physicians set down their tools, forgotten. For the first time in living memory, a London theater held an audience utterly devoid of laughter, not from fear, but from fascination. Afterward, Shakespeare received unexpected praise. "Marvelously dull," declared one earl, wiping a tear of relief from his eye. "Didn't so much as chuckle once," said another, as if this were the highest compliment one could pay a play. The Queen herself remarked that it was refreshing not to fear for one's life at the theater, though she did suggest adding a few jokes in the next one, provided they're properly dreadful. The play's success spawned imitations across Europe. "Tragedy is the new comedy," declared a Venetian impresario. German playwrights competed to produce the most humorless works imaginable. Even commedia dell'arte troupes, those purveyors of slapstick, began experimenting with tragic masks and somber scenarios. Yet human nature proved resilient. Within months, audiences began finding humor in the tragedies themselves. The very earnestness of Hamlet became a source of irony. Then, parody. Playwrights discovered that even their most solemn lines could provoke laughter if delivered with just the right wink. The cycle began anew. Shakespeare, ever the pragmatist, took it all in stride. He'd learned the essential lesson of his age, that laughter, like death, comes for us all eventually. The trick was to ensure it happened to someone else's audience. And so the show went on, as it always must. Actors performed, audiences reacted, and somewhere in the dark, physicians stood ready with their lancets, waiting to see who would laugh last. Chapter 8. The Church's Stern Frown. The Archbishop's study smelled of beeswax and old parchment, the scent of centuries of solemn contemplation. Cardinal Borromeo sat perfectly still behind his desk, his sharp nose buried in a report that had traveled all the way from Florence. The lone candle flickered as he read, casting shadows that made the painted saints on the walls appear to grimace in disapproval. The report detailed another laughing death, this time a wealthy merchant who had expired during a particularly rowdy carnival celebration. The man's final act had been to clutch his chest while dressed as a giant phallus. Borromeo set down the parchment with the care one might afford a venomous snake. "This," he declared to the young priest hovering at his elbow, "is why we banned carnival last year." The Church had always maintained an uneasy relationship with laughter. St. Augustine called it a convulsion of the diaphragm that brings man dangerously close to the beast. Thomas Aquinas permitted modest mirth in moderation, provided it didn't distract from pious contemplation. But now, with people dying mid-chuckle across Christendom, the theological debate took on new urgency. A council was convened in Rome, where elderly cardinals argued in circles until their voices grew hoarse. One faction insisted laughter was God's punishment for sinners, the divine pricking human vanity like an overinflated bladder. Another countered that Satan, not God, must be the architect of this plague, corrupting joy into a weapon. A particularly ascetic bishop from Naples proposed that all humor be banned outright, prompting an unfortunate giggle from a junior cleric who found the notion absurd. The resulting glare could have frozen wine in its flask. Meanwhile, in the confessional booths of Europe, priests found themselves facing strange new admissions. "Bless me, Father, for I have laughed," whispered a Florentine banker, his voice trembling with guilt. "During Mass?" asked the priest, horrified. "No," came the reply, "but I imagined the bishop falling into a canal, and then couldn't stop." Penances were assigned with increasing confusion. Was 5 Hail Marys sufficient for accidental mirth? Should uncontrollable giggles warrant fasting? The situation reached its nadir during a papal audience in 1567, when a visiting nobleman from Burgundy collapsed in a fit of laughter at the sight of His Holiness's new lapdog, a particularly ridiculous creature with bulging eyes and an unfortunate tendency to sneeze during prayers. As physicians rushed forward and the nobleman gasped his last, the dog chose that moment to relieve itself on the papal slipper. The resulting silence was so profound, one could hear a cardinal's teeth grinding in the back of the room. Pius Vaut, never known for his sense of humor, responded with characteristic severity. His encyclical Risus Disciplina established new guidelines for Christian conduct. Jokes were permitted only if they improved moral character, caused no physical reaction beyond a slight smile, and were approved in advance by local clergy. Carnival celebrations were cancelled indefinitely. Comedians required ecclesiastical licenses. The enforcement proved predictably uneven. In Spain, the Inquisition took to burning joke books along with heretics. German priests nailed "Laughter is the devil's music" signs to church doors. Venetian clergy, more pragmatic, simply taxed humor, charging 2 soldi for a dirty joke, 5 for political satire with special rates for traveling performers. Yet even the Church's sternest frowns couldn't suppress human nature entirely. Monks developed coded gestures to share jokes during silent meals. Nuns whispered puns behind their wimples. One particularly bold Franciscan in Assisi composed an entire cycle of spiritually edifying jests that somehow managed to mock everyone from bishops to beggars, while remaining technically within papal guidelines. His laughing saints became an underground sensation, copied and recopied until the original manuscript fell apart. The irony wasn't lost on Jacopo the Fool, who found himself briefly imprisoned in Milan for inciting dangerous mirth. As the jailer led him to his cell, Jacopo couldn't resist pointing out that the man's keys jingled exactly like a jester's bells. The resulting chuckle echoed through the prison corridors, followed by a panicked "God preserve us," as the jailer crossed himself. By the decade's end, even the most zealous reformers had to admit partial defeat. Laughter, like sin, proved impossible to eradicate. The Church settled for warning against excess, classifying fatal hysteria as a form of divine correction, and quietly retiring that unfortunate papal dog to a distant monastery. Some said the whole affair proved the devil's cleverness, turning even joy into a snare for souls. Others whispered that perhaps God himself had a sense of humor, allowing his servants to learn humility through the very mirth they sought to control. As for Cardinal Borromeo, he took to keeping a small leather-bound notebook in his sleeve. When asked about it during a particularly dull synod, he merely smiled and said it contained theological reflections. The truth, that he'd begun collecting jokes for anthropological study, was between him and his confessor. Even men of God, it seemed, needed to smile sometimes, provided, of course, they did so discreetly and without endangering their immortal souls. Chapter 9. The Physician's Baffled Notes. The manuscript smelled of old parchment and something faintly metallic, perhaps ink, perhaps the blood-stains from unwashed hands that had paged through it over the decades. Dottore Moretti's private journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his Florentine study, contained the most meticulous documentation of the laughing deaths anyone had ever compiled. And in margins, in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the years progressed, the aging physician had scribbled his frustrated observations, theories, and the occasional blasphemy when yet another hypothesis failed to hold water. Case Fotet, young silk merchant's daughter, Aga 19, read one typical entry. Healthy constitution, no history of humoral imbalance, collapsed during engagement party after Jester's ribald song about cuckolds, lips cyanotic, pupils dilated, extremities cold within minutes. Autopsy revealed ruptured vessels surrounding the heart, yet no sign of previous weakness. Query: does laughter sharpen the blood like a dagger, allowing it to cut what should remain? Below this, in different ink added weeks later. Nonsense. Next theory. Moretti wasn't alone in his confusion. Across Europe, baffled physicians filled notebooks with similar cases, each more perplexing than the last. A Parisian doctor recorded how a nun had died giggling during a particularly irreverent puppet show, performed by traveling players outside her convent walls. A Viennese surgeon described a butcher who expired mid-joke at his own wedding feast, his final words being, "Wait, wait, I haven't told the punchline yet," before slumping face first into the roast pig. The medical explanations grew increasingly creative as conventional wisdom failed. Some physicians blamed an excess of aerated blood caused by rapid breathing during laughter. Others pointed to sudden imbalances between the four humors, with yellow bile supposedly rising too quickly during fits of mirth. A particularly eccentric German physician published a treatise claiming the diaphragm could snap like an overstretched lute string if provoked too violently by amusement. Moretti's own theories evolved over time. Early entries suggested the victims might have weak hearts exacerbated by the physical exertion of laughter. Later, he pondered whether some unseen poison might be carried on the breath of those telling jokes. His final, most desperate hypothesis involved invisible creatures transmitted through mirth. a notion so radical he dared not publish it lest his colleagues think him mad. The treatments attempted were as varied as they were ineffective. Venetian physicians prescribed strict diets of bland foods to calm the spirits. English doctors recommended daily bleedings to prevent excessive humors from accumulating. One French practitioner developed a special corset with metal ribs meant to prevent the diaphragm from moving too vigorously during laughter, though most patients refused to wear the uncomfortable contraption unless threatened with excommunication. Perhaps the most poignant entries in Moretti's journal weren't his clinical observations, but his personal notes. Attended the Ridolfi banquet tonight, read one from 1562. Young Lorenzo made a joke so crude I cannot commit it to paper, yet found myself laughing despite better judgment. Felt peculiar tightness in chest afterwards. Note, if I perish from this affliction, let it be known I died a hypocrite. As the years passed and the phenomenon showed no signs of abating, a peculiar specialization emerged in medical circles, physicians who studied nothing but laughter and its effects. They called themselves gelotologists, from the Greek gelos meaning laughter, though their work was anything but amusing. These men, for they were invariably men, developed complex classification systems for different types of laughter, ranking them by potential lethality. The chuckle was deemed safest, while the full-bodied guffaw went in a special Reading category marked extreme hazard. The field reached its absurd zenith when Dr. Ferdinand of Prague published his infamous laughometer, a contraption of bellows and levers meant to measure the precise force of a patient's mirth. It worked, after a fashion, though its constant squeaking tended to provoke the very laughter it sought to quantify. 3 test subjects expired during trials, leading to the device's swift retirement to a university basement. Moretti, nearing the end of his career, made one final observation that cut through the pseudoscience. In shaky handwriting on what would prove to be his last journal entry, he wrote, "The young laugh freely and rarely die from it. The old, who should know better, perish mid-chuckle with alarming frequency. Perhaps the fatal element isn't the laughter itself, but the weight of years pressing down upon it. Or perhaps we simply forget how to breathe through joy as we age." He died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, leaving behind no evidence that his final theory was ever tested. His journal passed to a nephew, who promptly sold it to a curiosity collector. The laughing deaths continued, though with less frequency as the century waned. Whether because people learned caution, or because the world simply grew less amusing. Centuries later, medical students would stumble upon these old case studies in university archives and chuckle at the primitive theories, unaware of the irony. The journals remained, yellowed and fragile, a testament to medicine's long struggle to explain why sometimes, against all reason and physiology, happiness could be deadly. And in the margins of a certain Florentine physician's final entry, unnoticed until modern times, a single phrase had been scratched out, and then hastily scratched out. With spectral imaging one could just make it out. God's final joke on physicians, to make mirth a murderer, and leave us guessing why. Chapter 10. The Festival of Fools. The cobblestones of Lyon trembled underfoot as the procession wound through the city's twisted streets. A river of masked revelers flowing between half-timbered houses, leaning so close they nearly kissed overhead. It was the Feast of Fools, that glorious annual inversion where beggars paraded as kings, priests told bawdy jokes from the pulpit, and the natural order of the world turned delightfully upside down for one chaotic day. At least that was how it was supposed to work. This year, an undercurrent of nervous energy coursed beneath the merriment, the knowledge that today's laughter might be tomorrow's obituary. At the procession's head strode the year's elected fool, Pope, a gangly cooper named Mathieu, who had won the honor by drinking an entire barrel of cheap wine without pausing for breath. His makeshift tiara of chicken bones and dried peas sat askew atop his wild curls as he waved a sausage scepter at the cheering crowds. Behind him, the town's actual bishop followed in chains of painted wood, played by the local brothel keeper, who took the opportunity to improvise an exaggerated sermon about the virtues of lusty widows. Normally, this would have sent the crowd into convulsions of laughter. Today, the chuckles were measured, cautious, punctuated by nervous glances at the physicians stationed at every corner with their lancets and leeches at the ready. The tension broke when a group of butchers' apprentices rolled out their annual centerpiece, a giant effigy of the city mayor with an anatomically exaggerated rear end that, when activated by hidden strings, would fart a cloud of flour into the crowd. Last year's model had reportedly killed a visiting cloth merchant who laughed so hard he toppled into a horse trough and drowned. This year's version had been modified with less powder and a warning bell. But when the mechanism triggered with a sound like a demonic trumpet, the resulting explosion of mirth rippled through the square like a visible wave. Near the fountain, a plump haberdasher clutched his sides, face turning an alarming shade of purple before his wife shoved a leather strap between his teeth, the latest fashionable precaution against fatal hysteria. A cluster of nuns, permitted this one day to shed their solemnity, giggled behind their hands like schoolgirls until their prioress fixed them with a glare that could chill soup. Even the physicians found themselves suppressing smiles, though whether from professional duty or fear of setting a bad example was unclear. The real trouble began when the procession reached the cathedral square, where a makeshift stage had been erected for the traditional satirical play. This year's offering, Waughty Emperor's New Humor, mocked the recent royal edicts against excessive laughter by depicting a king so afraid of joy he outlawed smiling. The actor playing the monarch wore an elaborate mechanical frown that sprang tighter whenever someone chuckled, which only made the situation more absurd. By the third act, half the crowd was gasping for breath between suppressed laughs, their faces contorted in that peculiar grimace of someone trying desperately not to enjoy themselves too much. Then young Pierre the tanner's son, who had volunteered for the dangerous role of court jester, delivered the climactic line, "Sire, if you ban laughter, what will we do at your execution?" The king's mechanical frown snapped shut with such force it pinched his nose, producing an undignified squeak. But the effect was instantaneous. A merchant's wife snorted wine through her nose. A blacksmith's apprentice fell to his knees, pounding the cobblestones. The bishop's stand-in laughed so hard his wooden chains snapped. And in the front row, the town's actual magistrate, who had attended incognito, began wheezing in a manner that made the nearest physician reach for his bleeding bowl. What happened next became the stuff of local legend. As the magistrate turned an alarming shade of blue, the crowd's laughter took on a panicked edge. People clutched neighbors for support, tears streaming down faces that couldn't decide whether to grin or grimace. The physicians rushed forward only to find themselves laughing at their own seriousness. Even the fool pope collapsed onto his sausage scepter, which broke in half with a comical splat. Miraculously, no one died. The magistrate recovered with nothing worse than bruised ribs from laughing. The physicians, humbled, declared it a medical marvel. The event entered civic history as the Great Chuckle, and for years afterward, townsfolk would ask, "Were you there?" when all Lyon laughed as one, with the reverence normally reserved for religious experiences. In the aftermath, something subtle shifted in the city's attitude toward the laughing deaths. Where once there had been fear, now there was a cautious acceptance, the understanding that some risks were worth taking for the sake of joy. The next year's Festival of Fools proceeded without a single fatality, though the farting mayor effigy was retired by popular demand after the real mayor's wife complained it was too accurate. As for Pierre the tanner's son, he leveraged his notoriety into an apprenticeship with a traveling theater troupe. His first role, playing a physician in a comedy about the perils of excessive seriousness. The irony wasn't lost on the people of Lyon, who chuckled fondly at the news, carefully, moderately, but with genuine warmth. Because in the end, the Festival of Fools had taught them an important lesson, that laughter, like life itself, was a gamble. And while the dice might sometimes land badly, refusing to throw them at all was its own kind of death. Chapter 11. The Tragicomedy of Daily Life. Death in Renaissance Florence kept regular hours. It arrived with the morning bread, when the baker's boy called out prices alongside the latest tally of plague victims. It lingered in market squares, where public executions drew larger crowds than traveling players. It sat at dinner tables in the empty chairs of children taken by fever, and stood quietly in bedchambers where wives expired during their 12th childbirth. Against this constant companionship with mortality, laughter became both weapon and wound, the only shield against despair, yet potentially lethal in its own right. The people developed peculiar rituals to navigate this paradox. Shopkeepers kept ledgers with 2 sets of accounts, one for finances, another tracking which customers had died laughing, marked with a small skull beside their names. Mothers taught children to cover their mouths when giggling, not just for modesty but as a precaution against inhaling too much joy at once. Even the city's famed bell towers took on new significance, their chimes marking not just the hours but serving as reminders to moderate one's mirth before the next tolling. At the sign of the Three Graces Tavern, regulars had developed an elaborate system of laughter checks. Before sharing a joke, the teller would gauge his audience, a gentle tease for the young and hearty, perhaps a dry observation for the elderly merchant with the telltale vein throbbing at his temple. If someone laughed too long, others would subtly nudge a tankard of watered wine their way, or casually mention the high cost of funeral shrouds to sober the mood. The tavern keeper kept a bucket of cold water behind the bar, though whether this was for dousing over-enthusiastic patrons or reviving them remained ambiguous. This delicate dance between joy and caution permeated every aspect of life. The city's famed artists painted smiles with careful restraint, knowing too much delight in a portrait might doom the subject. Matchmakers considered a family's laughter history when arranging marriages. A clan known for weak constitutions and hearty senses of humor made risky in-laws. Even the annual palio horse race took on new dimensions, as spectators tried to contain their excitement lest someone expire from exhilaration before the finish line. The wealthy employed mirth monitors, servants trained to recognize the warning signs of dangerous amusement. These vigilant souls carried smelling salts and soft cushions, ready to intervene when their master's chuckles grew too robust. One particularly innovative Florentine banker commissioned a special chair with straps to restrain his shoulders during comedic performances, though he abandoned it after nearly suffocating during a puppet show. For the poor, who couldn't afford such precautions, life became a series of calculated risks. Was laughing at the landlord's ridiculous hat worth a potential apoplexy? Might mocking the tax collector's lisp prove fatal? Street vendors developed coded warnings. A particular cry of fresh figs meant dangerously funny gossip was being shared in the alley behind the butcher's shop. The city's children, as children do, turned the phenomenon into play. They invented games like Hold Your Chuckles, where the loser was whoever laughed first at absurd faces. Giggle Graveyard involved telling jokes beside a chalk-drawn tombstone, stepping back with each laugh until someone crossed the death line. Dark humor flourished in schoolyards where boys dared each other to read Dr. Moretti's case studies aloud without smiling. Even religion adapted. Preachers discovered that congregations responded better to sermons peppered with light humor, though they took care to pause between jokes, giving parishioners time to catch their breath. Some inventive friars developed laughing prayers, rhythmic chants that allowed controlled release of mirth while maintaining spiritual decorum. A particularly progressive convent began staging pious comedies where the moral lessons came wrapped in gentle humor, though the abbess strictly enforced a 3-chuckle maximum per performance. The city's physicians, overwhelmed by demand, took to prescribing laughter in careful doses like the dangerous medicine it had become. One just after meals, a typical prescription might read, to be taken seated with a cool compress at hand. Apothecaries sold risus moderatus pills, likely placebos of honey and herbs, guaranteed to regulate one's sense of humor. Through it all, Florence persisted in its strange duality, a city that buried its dead by morning and invented new forms of comedy by afternoon. The same citizens who crossed themselves at passing funeral processions would later risk their lives for a perfect pun about the deceased. Graveyards became popular spots for romantic trysts, as young lovers discovered nothing heightened passion like the proximity of mortality. Perhaps this was the greatest paradox of all, that in flirting so constantly with death, Florentines learned to live more fully. They treasured each safe laugh as a small victory, each survived joke as a reprieve from the inevitable. The baker whose father had died mid-chuckle might still tease his wife about her burnt bread, though he'd pause afterwards to check his pulse. The widow who lost her husband to a fit of giggles at their wedding feast could still appreciate irony, even as she avoided comedies. In the end, the people of Florence understood what their physicians and philosophers did not, that a life without laughter was its own kind of death, and that some risks were worth taking for the sake of joy. So they laughed carefully, but they laughed. They buried their dead, told inappropriate jokes at the wakes, and carried on, because the alternative was unthinkable. And when, inevitably, someone collapsed at a feast or expired during a particularly good jest, the survivors would raise their glasses in a bittersweet toast. To life, however long it lasts, and however it may end. Then they'd drink, perhaps a bit more cautiously than before, but drink all the same. Because in Renaissance Florence, every day was a tragicomedy, and everyone, both actor and audience, in the grand play of existence. Chapter 12. The Last Laugh. The grand irony of Renaissance Florence's laughing epidemic was that no one could agree how it ended. Physicians quietly stopped recording cases in their ledgers. Priests ceased preaching against dangerous mirth. The fear that had once gripped the city faded like old frescoes exposed to sunlight, leaving behind only faint traces of its existence. One day, people simply realized they'd stopped worrying about dying from a joke. Jacopo the Fool, now gray-bearded and less nimble, but still sharp-tongued, noticed it first during a performance for Duke Cosimo's 60th birthday. He delivered his usual barbed commentary on court politics, expecting the usual restrained chuckles and cautious applause. Instead, the hall erupted in the kind of unfettered laughter he hadn't heard since his youth. No one clutched their chests. No physicians rushed forward. The Duke himself laughed until tears streaked his powdered cheeks, then waved for more wine rather than a healer. The change wasn't immediate nor universal. Old habits, the harder than Florentina bankers, and some citizens continued taking precautions well into their dotage. The widow Beatrice could still be seen at public gatherings, glaring at anyone whose laughter exceeded what she deemed a safe volume. Apothecaries continued selling anti-hysteric tonics to nervous customers, though the recipes grew suspiciously similar to ordinary cordials. Dottore Moretti's journals, once coveted medical texts, gathered dust in the university archives until some bright student rebound them as a joke, an act that would have scandalized previous generations but now merely earned mild reproach from librarians. The church, never one to admit changing its mind, simply stopped mentioning laughter in its warnings about moral dangers, focusing instead on newer threats like coffee and novels. Historians would later debate what caused the phenomenon's disappearance. Some argued improved diets made hearts more resilient. Others suggested people had simply developed immunity through constant exposure. A radical few posited that the human soul had evolved beyond such frailties, though this theory found little support among those who actually interacted with humanity. The truth, perhaps, was simpler. Life in Florence had grown marginally less brutal. Plagues came less frequently. Wars burned shorter. Medicine advanced just enough to make death feel slightly more optional. With the constant presence of mortality pushed back half a step, people no longer needed laughter quite so desperately, and so it ceased to be dangerous in its intensity. Yet something was lost in the transition. The careful artistry of measured humor gave way to cruder amusements. The exquisite tension of a perfectly balanced joke, one that risked killing its audience, became a relic of a more passionate age. Later generations would laugh louder and longer, but never again with that electric awareness that each chuckle might be their last. Jacopo, nearing the end of his career, recognized this change in his final performance. The Duke had granted him an unusual request, to perform not in the palace, but in the public square where ordinary Florentines could attend. He chose his material carefully, not the safe, refined jests he perfected during the danger years, but the old dangerous routines from his youth. The crowd reacted as humans always had to true comedy, with surprise, delight, and uncontrolled laughter. But no one gasped for breath. No one collapsed. The performance ended not with tragedy, but with ordinary applause. As Jacopo took his bow, he realized with bittersweet satisfaction that his art was no longer lethal. He died peacefully in his sleep 3 nights later, a faint smile on his lips. The city mourned, then moved on. New fools with new jokes took his place. The Arno kept flowing. Life continued. And somewhere in the cosmos, if the philosophers were right and God did have a sense of humor, perhaps there was a quiet chuckle at the realization that the greatest joke of all had been on the Florentines, making them fear laughter until they learned to live with it, then taking the danger away just when they'd grown accustomed to the risk. The last laugh, as it turned out, belonged not to any mortal fool, but to time itself. And time, being infinite, could afford to wait.